from Berkeley linguistics professor George Lakoff. He makes the case that conservatives are winning the language wars and maps out a guide for liberals on how they can improve their message.
Thank you all for coming tonight. The Commonwealth Club is an extraordinary institution, and all the more important because we now have a crisis in public discourse in this country. This crisis kind of began, I would date it, to 1971, when Lewis Powell, just before he went on the Supreme Court, nominated by Richard Nixon, wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And in that memo, he, at the height of the Vietnam War, said to the Chamber of Commerce, "We conservative businessmen have a problem. The best and brightest of our students do not want to become conservative businessmen. This is terrible. We have to do something about it. Here's a plan. We have to put our money together and endow professorships teaching our beliefs at major universities. We have to start institutes at major universities and support those that are there, like the Hoover Institution at Stanford, for example, or the Olin Institute at Harvard. But we can't depend on universities. We have to start our own research institutions, hence the Heritage Foundation and so on. In addition, he said, what we need to do is fund these very well so that our scholars will have the best research facilities, well-paid researchers and research assistants, and in order to publish, they're going to have magazines, journals, and publishing companies that will publish their books and get them out there. And we will also have to get media control, because we're going to have to get these ideas out there in the media and spend money on communications. All right, that was the plan. He then went on to Supreme Court, and the plan was taken up by William Simon, Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, father of the current William Simon. And this plan has been carried out extraordinarily. Since then, between 40 and 80 major think tanks have been built over the years on the right. They have spent about $3.5 billion. Their current spending is about $400 million a year. The spending ratio, let's say, of institutions on the right and institutions of a progressive nature is about 8-to-1, and the airtime they get is about 8-to-1. So money talks. And about 80% of the talking heads on TV are conservatives. That's not an accident. There's a booking agency that books them there, and the think tanks have facilities on the grounds where you can walk down the hall and go on TV or radio. The booking agency knows every radio and TV station in America and has a list of experts on every issue and can get them on very quickly. During the Schiavo case, they had 15 full-time bookers working 24/7 to get conservatives on TV. You never saw any neuroscientists on TV. At least I never saw any. Now, what they've achieved is quite remarkable. They have achieved the ability to frame public discourse their way. And let me try to give you a sense of what framing is about. Let's take an issue coming up this week, what is called lobbying reform, quote unquote. There are a lot of, in the Abramoff case, there's a lot of responses. We need to reform lobbying. Now, Mark Schmidt, in his blog recently, pointed out correctly that this is a frame that says the problem is lobbyists. Now, lobbyists by themselves, as he points out, have no influence. That is, unless the legislatures take the money from the lobbyists, nothing happens, right? Unless they do what the lobbyists want, nothing happens, right? So it's not the lobbyists who have to be reformed, it's the Congress. This is an issue of congressional integrity and the betrayal of public trust. That is not discussed right now. If you go on the airwaves, you will hear, as this develops, lots about lobbying reform and nothing about congressional integrity, yet that should be the issue discussed. This is a simple case of framing, what I'll call surface framing, a case of one issue framed in one way where the consequences are given by the frame. As soon as you say it's lobbying reform, and are you for or against lobbying reform, it doesn't matter if you're for or against. I mean, who would be against lobbying reform anyway? You know, it's the lobbyists who are the problem. And that is what framing is about. Framing defines the problem. Framing limits what you can talk about. It leaves out, in this case, the congressmen who take the money. It leaves out what lobbying really is, and which has to do with campaigns and campaign contributions and so on. All of that is not in there quite in the frame. Now, how does this work? How does framing in general work? How is it possible for public discourse to be framed, particularly by people from one political point of view? It has to do with the way the brains work. A frame is a conceptual structure, and they're common. They're not just about politics. The notion of a bottle has a frame. It's a container. You can usually pick it up in your hand. It usually contains liquid and a way to pour things in and pour things out and drink out of it and so on. There's a simple frame for an understanding of a bottle. Every word comes with a conceptual frame. If you've learned the word, then you know the frame. And to know the frame means that it is physically in your brain. You think with your brain. How else? Well, if you know something about neuroscience and neural computation, and that's my job, I'm a cognitive scientist, that's part of what I do, there are structures in the brain that characterize what these frames are, and they get there through repetition. By continual activation, the synapses become stronger and stronger until they become permanent parts of your brain. This is what has happened over the past 35 years. And it's very important that we understand this. It's not something that we will necessarily. And a lot of the right-wing frames that have come about have become part of public, not only public discourse, but part of most people's brains, physically. Let's take a common example from this week. Take the notion of strict constructionism, which is going on in the Alito trial right now. There you have the idea of, which is very interesting metaphors, following the law, as if the law was a path and you just go along it. You have nothing to do with it, you just go where the law tells you. Or Alito says he does what the law requires, as if the law were an agent and he was not. The law was requiring it, not me. He gives a narrow interpretation. He does what the Constitution says. Now, and it's almost as if the judge were a machine. He applies the law. The law is there. He applies it. He does what the law says, just mechanically. Now, this is a little strange. After all, he says he does what the law says, but he wrote dissenting opinions, opinions against what was taken to be the law. You know, it's very strange to say he would judge according to the law, but he would presumably judge according to his dissenting opinions. So there's a little bit funniness here. But the funniness is in the very notion of a strict construction of the Constitution. In order for any case to reach the Supreme Court, it cannot fit normal categories. If it's a straightforward case of theft, a straightforward case of murder, a straightforward case of embezzlement, someone's caught, they've got the evidence, it never gets to the Supreme Court. It fits the category, no problem. In order for a case to get to the Supreme Court, it must not fit the categories. That's the only way that can happen. Now, when a judge gets a case that does not fit the categories, the Supreme Court must extend or contract the categories to make it fit in some way. Whether they extend it in a broad interpretation or narrow it in a narrow interpretation, they are changing the meaning of the words. And when they change the meaning of the words, they change the world, because those are laws and they affect people. And it doesn't matter whether they narrow it or broaden it. They're going to change how the law applies, and they will change what is legal and what is illegal. There is no way that any Supreme Court of any kind can avoid doing that. There is no such thing as the strict construction of the Constitution. It is cognitively impossible. Ask any cognitive scientist. Now, this is not out there in the public. It is not discussed. And it needs to be. It definitely needs to be. Now, let's take another issue. Alito this week said he would not follow any agenda. Notice what you have is an agenda frame. An agenda is a conscious list of goals that you're trying to achieve. It's consciously listed. But agendas are not what's at issue here. What's at issue is worldview. The question is, how does this judge or any judge understand the world? How is the world viewed by a given person? And worldview is a rather remarkable thing. A worldview is something that, again, is part of your brain, and it's usually unconscious. You usually don't know you have one. You think you're just using common sense. But what cognitive scientists have realized is that there is no such thing as universal common sense. It doesn't exist. Everybody has frames, and everybody has a worldview, and they have different frames. And it's the worldview, which is in your brain, and what's in your brain defines common sense. Let me tell you how I got onto this in the case of politics. Back in 1994, I, out of public duty, read the Contract with America. I think it's very important to read what people are writing who disagree with you, which is why this forum is so important. And what I found was something that really befuddled me. I had written a book on categorization, and I found that I didn't understand the category conservative. Why? Well, here was a list of positions. Here are people who are against abortion and for the flat tax. What does abortion have to do with the flat tax? They're for the flat tax and against environmental regulation. What does one thing have to do with another? They're against environmental regulation and for owning guns. What is that? What do they have to do with each other? And they're for tort reform. What does that have to do with owning guns? I didn't get it. So I asked myself, look, I have the opposite views on all of these things. What do my views have to do with each other? And I got very embarrassed because I could not answer this question, and this is my field. Right? I'm an academic. I'm supposed to know about categories and so on. And this was embarrassing. And I'm interested in politics. I have strong views. I couldn't explain my own views. So, however, I realized that this was a problem in my discipline. It's a cognitive science problem. I study conceptual systems. What conceptual system governs conservatives, and what conceptual systems governs progressives? I started doing research on it, and the answer came from an interesting place, from the conservative think tanks. They knew the answer. The answer was family values. It turns out that we all have a metaphor that the nation is a family. We speak of our founding fathers. Nobody says, fathers? Why fathers? Right? That's natural. You speak of your founding fathers. We send our sons and daughters to war. There are daughters of the American Revolution. We have a nation as family metaphor, and we're not the only country that does. There's Mother Russia, Mother India, the fatherland. It is normal to understand large social groups in terms of the most common social group, the family. So as a metaphor theorist, what I did was I sat down and said, okay, what does this metaphor look like? And I sat down, worked it out in detail, That's my job. We can write these down in formal terms. And when I did, what emerged, I asked myself the question, well, if you have two different notions of the nation, maybe there are two different notions of the family. So I worked backwards. I took the different political positions, and I said, what notion of the family would map onto these? And out popped two notions of the family, and idealized notions: a strict father family and a nurturing parent family. And then later on, I found out, in fact, that the strict father family was just what James Dobson was teaching as child rearing. James Dobson, for those of you who aren't aware of it, is the head of Focus on the Family. He is the most popular columnist in America. His column is in more newspapers than anyone. He's on 3,000 radio stations. And so many people write away for his books and pamphlets that he needs his own zip code. His classic book is Dare to Discipline. Now, here's how it works. There is an idealized model of the family, and I want to say these are idealized. It's not the case that every family works exactly this way. This is an idealized model. And it goes like this. You need a strict father because there's evil out there in the world, and he's got to protect you from evil. He's got to be strong enough to do that. You need a strict father because there's competition in the world, and there will always be winners and losers. And in order to support the family, he's got to be a winner, not a loser. You need a strict father because kids are born bad. They just want to do what feels good, not what's right. You need a strict father who knows right and wrong, who's a moral authority, who can teach kids right from wrong. And there's only one way to do that, as Dobson points out: punishment when they do wrong. Punishment painful enough so that they will have an incentive to do right and not wrong, and develop internal discipline on the basis of physical discipline. So that if they develop the internal discipline, they will become moral beings, and the assumption is that's the only way to create moral beings. By the way, he's a liberal on this, and more than other folks in the Christian coalition. He believes that it is there's no reason whatever to ever hit a child below the age of 15 months. Now, if you develop the right discipline to be a moral being, there's another part of the logic, because that gives you the discipline to seek your self-interest and become prosperous. So prosperity and morality are both tied to internal discipline. And there's a logic here. If you are not prosperous, you don't have the discipline to be prosperous, which means you don't have the discipline to be moral, and so you deserve your poverty. Okay? Think about what this says about social programs. It says social programs are immoral. Why? They're immoral because they give people things they haven't earned. If you give someone something they haven't earned, that takes away the incentive to be disciplined, and therefore the incentive to earn a living and to be moral. And therefore, all social programs are immoral and should be abolished. And that is part of conservative social thought. It's a very important part, and there's a very important piece of this. That is, you're supposed to follow your self-interest. And Dobson is clear about this. This is connected to free market capitalism. What Adam Smith said was that if everybody seeks their own profit, the profit of all will be maximized as a law of nature by the invisible hand. And this is applied to self-interest here. If everyone seeks their self-interest, the self-interest of all will be maximized by the invisible hand. It's a law of nature. And therefore, it's good, because when you seek your self-interest, you're helping everybody else. You're maximizing everybody else's self-interest. And who's hurting people? The people who get in the way of the good people seeking their self-interest. The people who are not seeking their own self-interest, but are trying to help others. They're called do-gooders. Right? You know any do-gooders? They're getting in the way of people seeking their self-interest. Now, the logic applied to politics and economics is very clear. What is it that allows, what mechanism allows this? The free market. What interferes with it? One, government regulation. Two, taxes, which which would take away the incentive to make more money. If you're going to pay a high tax rate, well, that takes away incentive, so that interferes. And three, the civil justice system, the ability to sue and to have civil suits against, say, corporations that do harm to the public. Okay, these are three mechanisms to be gotten rid of, and that is central to conservative policy. Another part of the strict father model is that when a child learns this discipline, they grow up, they become adults, then they are free. They can go on to be on their own. The strict father can no longer meddle in their lives. They can maybe protect them or help them in some way, but they can't meddle, can't tell them what to do, because you become your own strict fathers or your own strict mothers. Okay? So this is important, a very important part of the whole idea of strict father morality. And it works like that, and it comes with certain other ideas. One is the notion of a moral authority. A moral authority is the father who knows right from wrong, who has the power to punish and the power to tell you what to do. And that's good because he's moral. Morality and power should go together. And there's a hierarchy of that. The way to tell who's most moral is to look at traditional forms of power. So you have God above man, man above nature. Man above nature, very important. Adults above children, Western culture above non-Western culture, America above other nations. And that's part of general conservative thought. And then you get a bigoted extension. That is an extension to men above women, whites above non-whites, Christians above non-Christians, straights above gays. And that is what I'll call the moral order. And it's a very important part of conservative thought. At least the first part of it is general conservative thought, and then you get the not-so-nice extensions of it. Now, the other model is what I'll call a nurture and parent model. And it says that your job is to nurture your children and to raise your children to be nurturers of others. And nurturance is two things. Empathy. You have to know what your children need. You have to feel what they feel. And responsibility. You have to take care of yourself. You can't take care of anybody else if you're not taking care of yourself. And you have to be responsible for the people you're responsible for. You have to be responsible to raise children. And you teach your children to empathize, care about other people, to be responsible for themselves, and to have social responsibility, responsibility for others. That's the heart of a nurture and parent family, and it has consequences. And those consequences define what progressive morality is. The central ideas are empathy and responsibility, and then protection. You care about your child, you want to protect your child, and so we have in progressive thought notions like environmental protection, worker protection, consumer protection, safety nets. And then other ideas like fulfillment in life. If you're going to be fulfilled in life, then you need to be free. So freedom is a value. If you're going to be free, you need opportunity. And in order to be opportunity, there has to be general prosperity. These are all progressive values. You live in a community. What kind? You don't want a strict father community where somebody tells you what to do or else. You want a community where you have leaders who care about people and people who care about each other and are responsible to each other and serve the community. Right? That's the kind of community you want to live in. Those are the progressive values, and that's it. They come directly out of a nurture and parent family. So what you have are two very important models, and what's interesting is we all have both of them. If you live in this society, you know of both models. You may not actively live both of them. So you might be nurturant in everything you do, but if you can walk into an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie and understand it, you have a strict father model. And And the same thing goes for conservatives, who might be conservative in everything they do. If they can turn on the TV and watch a sitcom of their appropriate sort, or watch Oprah and understand it, not agree with it, but understand it, they at least have a passive model used for understanding. What's interesting is what I call biconceptuals, people who have both models in different parts of their life. Ronald Reagan realized that what would have come to be called the Reagan Democrats were blue-collar workers who were strict fathers at home, but nurturant in their union politics. And what he did was use metaphors for the home, from the home, to talk about politics. This is very important that he understood that, and Republicans since then have understood that. The people who are, quote, in the middle in this country, in terms of voters, are biconceptuals. And there is not a linear line. They can be people who are nurturant about the environment and conservative about everything else, or nurturant on social issues, but conservative on financial issues, or the reverse. There are lots of combinations, and you see them all around you, but that's what they're combinations of. And it's important to understand that. Now, these define your worldview. They are part of the way that you think. And as Joe was saying earlier, things that appear to be logically contradictory are not contradictory within one of those frames. So, how can you be pro-life and for the death penalty? Very, very clear. In a strict father worldview, punishment is required. It's moral. You must punish accordingly. Someone kills somebody, you have to punish them. That's it. Pro-life is very interesting because they're not really pro-life. And that's a very important thing to understand. Conservatives are not worried, let's say, about infant mortality. They're not worried about infant health care or starvation or anything like that. They're only concerned about issues of abortion. Well, why? Well, there are a couple of interesting reasons about that. Think of the strict father family. Who would have to get an abortion? Either a daughter or a wife. Who should be in control of that? The father, right? And in fact, we have, Alito saying that there should be husbands agreeing to abortion and so on. That this, and there's parental notification, which was on the ballot in California. That is, these are very clear cases where the issue is not just abortion per se. Abortion is symbolic of strict father morality, which is the basis of all conservative thought. What about what they would call gay marriage, what I would call freedom to marry? The issue that they call gay marriage, why do they call it gay marriage? Because it evokes the image of gay sex. Okay? That's why they call it that. That's why they name it that issue. Anytime you use that word, you're going to be helping them. This is not, it's important to talk about freedom to marry because this is a freedom issue. But when they talk about, quote unquote, gay marriage, what are they doing? They are appealing to people who have a strict father morality because this contradicts it. In a strict father model of the family, the parents can't be gay. There has to be a father and there has to be a mommy who supports him, who isn't able to protect, who isn't able to support, who isn't strict enough to teach the kids right from wrong, right? So it is a gendered model, and that's very, very important to understand. Now, framing is about ideas, and ideas like that. And by the way, in the case of the Alito trial, the issue is worldview, not agenda. He is going to come to every decision from a conservative worldview. Unconscious. He might even not know he has it. But he says, I will be open. He can't be open because he's going to be using his physical brain. And his physical brain is structured along these lines. That is the issue here, not a particular political agenda or conscious list, but the way that people think unconsciously, deeply. It's the deep issues that matter. I want to say a couple of things. One, about Katrina. Uh, the Democrats who said that this was a matter of failure of the Bush administration didn't really get it right. It was a failure of the Bush administration, but that wasn't the issue. And of course, that led to the idea that the conservatives said, well, this is just a failure of government. It shows government doesn't work. It really shows conservative government doesn't work. What it shows is really that it was a failure of political philosophy. The tragedy of Katrina could have been avoided. Why did the levees break? They weren't fixed. Why weren't they fixed? The money was taken away. What did the money go to? The war in Iraq and the tax cuts. One. What about hurricane warnings and preparedness? People who study global warming pointed out that the temperature of the Gulf had risen considerably, enough to produce many level 4 and 5, class 4 and 5 hurricanes, and that they would be hitting around New Orleans. Because the administration doesn't want to admit the existence of global warming, they're going to not look at the consequences of it. Third, FEMA was taken out of the cabinet by Bush, and he appointed to the head of FEMA first Joseph Albaugh, who was one of his campaign officials, and Albaugh went before the Appropriations Committee and asked to have his budget cut. If you ever heard, I've never heard this before, right? And what he said was that FEMA was an entitlement that should be gotten rid of. That FEMA should be the last resort, not the first resort. That it was the community's responsibility, individual responsibility, right? And that FEMA should come in later. This had to do with a failure of political philosophy in general. It was not just a failure of the Bush administration or of Michael Brown or any particular individual. It is a failure of a worldview. That was never said, and it's crucial that it be said. I want to talk a little bit about freedom. And in this, I think it's important to recognize something about the history of the country in this regard. Let me say one more thing about Katrina. Katrina had to do with the deep frames behind the administration's positions. And those deep frames include the idea that the government doesn't work, that it's private industry and the free market, unconstrained, unrestricted, that is good. You should privatize as much as possible. And that it's individual initiative that made the country great, not public initiative. That it's individual responsibility that matters, hence it's the localities that should bear the burden here, not others. And that everybody can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that it's your money, you know you can spend it better than the government can, therefore they have a set of arguments which, if part of people's brains can be used for private accounts, privatization of Social Security and retirement, it can be used against environmentalist positions, it can be used in case after case after case. It is not just one issue. It's a set of things that goes across all issues. There's an implicit idea on the progressive side that is not used. And it's an idea that has everything to do with the notion of the Commonwealth Club. It's the idea that we put our Commonwealth together for the common good to build an infrastructure that everybody can use, that helps every individual achieve their goals. For example, highways. You can't get it with your tax refund. Sorry, you can't build your own highways. I mean, maybe Bill Gates or somebody can, but most people can't. The internet was developed with taxpayers' money. The courts, you want to have contracts, you have to have a court system paid for out of the Commonwealth. The banking system is backed up by the government, paid for by the Commonwealth. The stock market has the SEC, paid for by the Commonwealth. The public education system, paid for by the Commonwealth. There was a reason why states used to be called commonwealths. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Virginia, of Pennsylvania, because they used the Commonwealth for the common good to build infrastructure that individuals couldn't do, and that helped everybody. Now, if someone makes a great deal of money off of that infrastructure, they should be paying back to it. That's what taxes are about, and that's what progressive taxation is about. If you get great wealth out of using the Commonwealth, you should pay that back. And the person who has written most about this is Bill Gates Sr., and Warren Buffett said something interesting. He said, if you dropped me in the middle of Bangladesh 30 years ago, I'd still be impoverished because they didn't have a banking system or a stock market. Now, let me finish up with something about freedom. This has always been a progressive country. And the way that you tell this is by looking at the way ideas have been extended over time and applauded because they've been extended that way. Take voting rights. When this country was founded, the only people who could vote was white male property owners. Then they slowly got rid of the property owning parts. Then they admitted slaves. They admitted women, etc. The Voting Rights Act admitted other people. We have gradually extended voting rights over a period of time, and it's been hailed as wonderful. What else? Public education. Started out with small schoolhouses and extended to high schools, colleges, graduate schools, etc. Civil rights have been extended further and further and further. Protections, whether they are of all sorts, worker protections. We used to have slavery, then we had sweatshops, and then unions were able to get the 5-day week, the 8-hour day, paid vacations, parental leave, and so on. They have extended. Public health has been extended, the media has been extended for free speech, opportunity has been extended. Those are progressive values, and they are the values that were there at the beginning and extended because they were there at the beginning, and the activism was an activist public. That's what extended those ideas. Now, what conservatives are trying to do, and the reason they concentrate on the Founding Fathers, is they want to go back and undo those. They want to undo those, and each of those things has to do with freedom. Voting rights is freedom from tyranny. Public education is freedom from ignorance and access to knowledge, where knowledge is power. Civil rights, freedom to participate in society. Protections, freedom from fear. Opportunity, freedom from want. Workers' rights, freedom from exploitation. Public health, freedom from the ravages of disease. Media extension, freedom of speech. These are freedoms, and they have been extended over time, and that is what we stand to lose right now. Thank you.
Our thanks to Professor Lakoff for his comments tonight, and now it's time for the question and answer portion of our program, as promised. And let me sort of give this disclaimer ahead of time. I'm recognizing the same handwriting on several of these cards, so I'm sure that some of you wrote more than one question, which is great. I think it's wonderful. I'm going to apologize in advance. We have a full house tonight. We have a time limit that I have to stick to rigidly because we're also on the air on radio right now, and we have to try and stay with that. So I can't probably do everybody's questions, but I have made an effort to group some of these where there are areas of similarity, and if the questions were similar, I'm trying to do that as much as possible. But if we don't get to your question tonight, I apologize for that and do the best that I can with this. So, Professor Lakoff, I think I'll actually start with some questions because from the biggest pile that it seemed to get, which had to do with the Democrats.
Yes?
Since that was, I think, a topic of the last book about the Don't Think of an Elephant. And here are a couple of questions. Well, we'll start with this one. A member of the audience wrote, although Howard Dean wrote the foreword to this book, I think, on the leadership of the Democratic Party, it has persistently failed to offer or articulate a compelling alternate vision to the country. What's it going to take for the Democrats? For example, discontinuing the media fund after the 2002 election. What will it take for Democrats to articulate a vision differently?
Notice the framing of the question. It assumes that it's up to the Democrats and not up to you. What it will take is the grassroots, public, progressives, out there in front. And it will take institutions, like just as they have their think tanks, we have institutions that we're developing, Rockridge being one of them, which is not about the Democrats, but it's about progressives, moderate Republicans, independents who have progressive thoughts. But the point is that the assumption is that it's up to the political leaders. If you look at what George Bush says, he doesn't say anything that hasn't been said 1,000 times before. That is, they have a system that gets the word out by other people first. They see what gets accepted, what works, and then Bush comes out and says what he has to say. It is wrong to assume that the political leaders are going to be able to come into a linguistic vacuum and a conceptual vacuum and just say some thought that you've never thought of before and that people won't quite understand. It's got to be said over and over. And that means that we need an informed, progressive public and saying these things. One of the reasons that we are working at Rockridge, at a progressive think tank, is to get this out. We're going to be putting out a progressive handbook and an online manual to help think through these issues and to help provide language and to help organize such groups. But it's important to say that it is not just up to the party. Now, the party has constraints, and there are problems there. First constraint. The people who are your people in Congress and in the Senate, who I think I've now met many of them, and I like them. I think they're better than their votes in many cases. That is, and there are cases where they vote out of expediency and compromise and so on. And I think they're afraid. They're afraid because there isn't a voice out there behind them. That when they say something, there's no echo chamber saying yes. They need that, and they need a voice out there. They don't want to be hung out alone, and they shouldn't be. Okay? In addition, they are under pressure. Newt Gingrich did something very smart. He had a bill that cut congressional staffs as saving the public's money, right? Well, what that meant was he was really cutting the Democratic staffs because the Republicans had 40 think tanks at the time for their staffs and lobbyists helping them to write legislation, right? So here, what you have, and then they changed the rules. So when they present legislation, they can do it, you know, they don't have to show the Democrats anything. They just put it out in the morning, and there's no staff there to go through it. Every day, the Democrats are fighting a defensive battle, and which is terrible. Now, the other thing is that they have a war room, but it's always on the defensive. It is not a war room that says, we're going to say positive things over the next 3 months at this, and this stages. It's on the defense. They don't have, because they're going from election to election and issue to issue, they don't have that sort of thing. Because they depend on pollsters go issue by issue. And therefore, what happens is they think issue by issue. They don't think over the full range of issues and over their deep values. Then there's another problem. When they come up with, they say, we want to come up with a democratic agenda, a democratic vision, they have to have something that everyone will agree with. Instead of people sort of going up a level and looking at the general values, what happens is everybody comes in and says, well, I don't believe that, you got to change it this way, and what you get is something written by committee. And that sounds blah. If you go and look at what the War Room and the DNC was putting out, it is America can do better was their slogan. I mean, it's like, you know, we're not quite as bad as the other guys.
Well, George, if I may, can I jump in? I want to
Yes.
repeat another question and off of
Sure.
that last point. One of our audience members asked, maybe because it speaks to your major point tonight about framing, this question, since you're on now talking about the message of the party, how does the concept of framing, in your mind, differ from those of the idea of message in the battle for public opinion issues that the Democratic Party has long, by your own admission, struggled with? How is framing different from the message itself?
Utterly different. The strict father and nurturing parent models frame your values. They frame the way you understand what it is to be governed. They frame your moral values. The idea of using the commonwealth for the common good is a political principle that is a deep frame as opposed to a surface frame. A surface frame goes along with words and slogans. Words and slogans don't help by themselves. They have to be hung upon the deep frames and the deep values. What you have to change are those, and those are the things you have to get out there. So framing is not just messaging. I mean, messaging requires surface frames, but they are of no use unless you get the deep frames right.
Okay. Bridging from broader labels than Democrats, I suppose, and Republicans to labels like conservatives, progressives, and liberals, this question from the audience. Conservatives, who are, in this person's opinion, more accurately called radicals, appear to have very focused messages that support a largely common agenda, while progressives are all over the map and try to address the complexity of our world. How can progressives, I guess this will speak to your point about framing, touch the hearts and minds of the broader public without an exponentially greater degree of focus and passion?
They need that exponentially greater degree of focus, and the way to do it is by focusing on the moral values, on empathy, responsibility, and what follows from that: protection, opportunity, community, and all those values. That is what is crucial. Focus on the moral values. Now, if you ask what kinds of progressives are there are 6 modes of progressive thought. 1, socioeconomic progressives who think that everything is a matter of money and class, and a lot of things are. By the way, they're all correct. All modes of thought are correct. It's just that they're special cases. There are identity politics progressives who say our oppressed group should get its chance now. And they're right, you should. In addition, there are green progressives who say this is a matter of sustainability and sacredness of the earth. They're right too. The civil libertarian progressives who say we have to protect our civil liberties. They're right. The spiritual progressives who view God not as a strict father but as a nurturing parent who's out there giving unconditional love and offering grace to people, that and where spiritual practice is community service, they're right too. And the anti-authoritarian progressives who say we have to fight against illegitimate uses of authority throughout our society. They're all right, and they're all special cases of nurturant morality. That's what they don't see. Each of them thinks they are the true progressives and that the other guys are wrong. That's a disaster, and we have to learn to overcome it.
Okay, staying with that for a moment, and now not thinking in terms of how liberals or progressives might communicate with the general public, but rather how they might talk to people who share opposite points of view. Apropos of your point about that, this question. This is probably a fairly liberal audience tonight. What's the best way for you and us to effectively communicate with others who are more conservative? For example, Professor Lakoff, what would you sound like tonight if you were giving your speech in front of James Dobson?
I'd give the same speech, and I'd tell him exactly what I thought, but I wouldn't try to convince him of anything, because I don't think he's convincible. However, the people who are convincible are those who are what I'll call the biconceptuals, who have strict father views in some parts of their lives and nurturing views in others. And this is a very, very deep point. The way that people identify themselves has to do with certain views that they have. And many people who are conservative on a lot of issues actually identify themselves in a deep way with progressive positions. For example, throughout the Midwest, I lived in the Midwest for some years, one of the things that struck me is that conservatives in the Midwest tend to like progressive communities. They want nurturing communities. They don't want leaders who tell them what to do or else. They want leaders who care about them, who are responsible. They want to live in a community where people care about each other, are responsible for each other, who do community service. They want nurturing communities. You can talk to people about that. There are a lot of people who are conservative about many things but love the land. They're basically environmentalists, though they wouldn't call themselves that. But who are they? They're hunters. They're fishermen who would like to be able to eat their fish, but in 48 states they now can't. And they're people who like to take their kids camping and take their families hiking in the national parks, who want to preserve land, who want to conserve resources. These are people who love the land in this country, and that is a nurturant position. And there are people who are concerned about their children's education and public education in the same way, and public health, who identify with their bodies and their health and their children's health. There are many things that you can talk to conservatives about, because most conservatives are not total conservatives. What we have for the first time in this country is an attempt to make everybody a total conservative on every issue. But it's not there. What you want to do is find out where their progressive heart is. And you ask a conservative, what do you care about? How do you do service toward that? Why do you care? What are you proud of in doing that? And so on. And you get a conversation going about the part of their lives where they share your values.
If I may, George, a quick question on that. Now, I've noticed in our discussion this evening that you've tended to refer to that side of this side of the audience as progressive, and I haven't heard you use the word liberal very often, which seemed to become a bad word during the '88 campaign when President Bush's father made it into a three-syllable word, I guess, liberal. But was that a frame as well, and is that an intentional non-use of a frame on your part in the discussion
yes,
tonight?
very intentional. First of all, the Center for American Progress did a survey before it chose its name, and it found that people were in favor of progressives and most people didn't like liberals. All right? Now, what's interesting, of course, is that liberals have been branded by the far right, but they've also been branded by the far left. So what you find, for example, on the far right is limousine liberals and latte liberals. Namely, this has to do with populism and right-wing populism that Thomas Frank wrote about in What's the Matter with Kansas. On the far left, you have neoliberal economics, which has to do with globalization, and you have the so-called liberal foreign policy that occurred with the Johnson administration during the Vietnam War. Right? So many people on the far left see themselves as anti-liberal at all, and the word liberal has become associated with those things. So until there is an attempt, a serious attempt to revive liberalism in some way, which would take a lot of work, the word progressive is usually favorable, so favorable that there are conservatives who want to call themselves progressive conservatives.
All right, bridging from the sort of the broader discussion about the groups, a contemporary sort of question out of the news from today, since you used this example, about Judge Alito and the nomination hearings in the Senate. This question from a listener, and by the way, for those of you in the radio audience, you're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program. Tonight's speaker is UC Berkeley linguistics professor. That's the University of California. We don't have to Berkeley in there. That's the only true one. Linguistic professor George Lakoff. Sorry for those of you from Stanford. All right. The question is this. What one question would you have asked Sam Alito, given your points about worldview, if you were in the hearing today, to elicit his worldview?
That's a very, very interesting question. I think I would ask him the following question. There are many questions I could ask. I mean, Do you really believe that everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps? And what about the 45 million people who have no health care right now? What about those people who do work for which they're not paid very much, but support the lifestyles of the top 3/4 of this country? Those 45 million people cannot just all of a sudden pull themselves up by their bootstraps all at once. No way. Some can, but not all, because who would do those jobs at those wages? We have an economy that drives down the cost of labor, and that economy has created a cheap labor trap. You know, how do you think about the cheap labor trap? What do you think about it? And do you really think that those 45 million people can all pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and who would do those jobs at those wages?
Okay. Staying with Judge Alito just for a moment, but now bridging perhaps into a central issue in the confirmation hearings, and that, of course, being the question about abortion, reproductive rights, question of choice as well. This question from one of the audience members. Can you recommend a better way of framing or a frame on the question of abortion, the abortion issue, other than pro-choice? And if so, what would that be?
Absolutely. We cannot let them have life. Life is a progressive value. It's our value. How do you start? You start with infant mortality. We have one of the highest rates of infant mortality in the industrialized world, the highest rate in the industrialized world. Why? Because of conservative politics. Because there are no funds for the things that other countries provide funds for: prenatal care, postnatal care, health insurance for children, making sure all children are well fed. It's conservatives who are killing babies. One. Two, you should think about the number 25,000, because that is the number of women who get pregnant from rape each year. 25,000 all over America. Should they be forced to bear the children of their rapists? And if the answer is no, there's a consequence. You have to have facilities for them everywhere in the country with trained doctors and easy accessibility. Right? That's another thing. Also, what about unwanted pregnancies? Nobody wants unwanted pregnancies. That's why they're called unwanted.
1 minute, George.
And how do they get there? They get there because of a lack of sex education, and they get there because of a lack of facilities and a lack of family planning facilities. And we need to provide those in our schools and throughout the country. Right? That's how I would answer it.
Okay. I'm afraid that that's all the time we have for questions tonight. My apologies for not doing more. But again, our special thanks to George Lakoff. If you're listening on the radio, this is the Commonwealth Club. Our guest tonight has been University of California Professor of Linguistics and a Senior Fellow at the Rockridge Institute, George Lakoff. He is the author, by the way, of Don't Think of an Elephant. Here's a copy of the book. We'd also like to thank our audiences here live and on the radio. And my name is Joe Tuman, and now on behalf of the Commonwealth Club of California, celebrating more than a century of enlightened discussion like this tonight, I thank you all, and I adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. We'll be doing a book signing, and we'll have Mr. Lakoff, Dr. Lakoff sitting right here. If you want your book signed, please line up through that aisle, that way.
George Lakoff is a linguistics professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Don't Think of an Elephant is published by Chelsea Green. Visit chelseagreen.com for more information.